Peta in London, she's had an interview with the most intriguing Douglas Murray.
Yes, he's certainly brilliant. It's been a real list of A-listers on the podium at ARC, and the standout there for me was Douglas Murray. You'll know him as the author of books such as The Strange Death of Europe and War on the West, and they tackle the self-inflicted pain that mass migration is doing to countries like Britain, much of Europe, and we fear Australia too. Douglas Murray, thank you. We'll get to the cultural impact of immigration in a moment, but the economic good of migration in Australia, we're told it's undeniably positive for the economy. More and more, better and better, and even if in per capita terms Australians are worse off, and they are, the greater good is more and more people coming to our country. What's been the experience economically for Europe and the UK from migration?
I mean, that is almost everywhere in the developed world a lie. And it's a lie that's been exposed for at least 25 years now. Migration from the developed world into the from the developing world into the developed world does see an uptick sometimes in some of the figures, but the benefits entirely accrue to the migrant. And that makes total sense. And I mean, some people are finally coming around to this now, but if somebody moves into a developed society, they have the ability to take out in welfare, they have the ability to take out in housing and much more. It makes sense that unless somebody is the highest net worth earner, they are going to be taking out more in services than they are going to be putting in taxes. And that is going to be the case for most people at least many years, and in many cases their entire lifetime. This has been proven in study after study for 25 years, except that nobody wanted to draw the obvious conclusion and act on that. And I wrote about this in The Strange Death of Europe, and I said then what the economic impacts were. I said also what the cultural impacts are. But the economic impact is clear.
When Australia had waves of immigration post the Second World War, predominantly Greeks, Italians, people fleeing the chaos of Europe, yes, they were culturally different, but they assimilated relatively quickly. They built small businesses, they contributed to Australian life. They are Australian absolutely now. What's been so different with migration in the last 20 years into Australia, into places like Europe, when people are coming predominantly out of the Middle East?
Well, I mean, there's lots of effects. There are three things that matter in migration. There is the speed of the migration, the numbers, and the identity. Of those three, we are capable these days of talking about speed, and we are capable of talking about numbers. We're not very good at it, but we're capable of it. The third one, identity, is the one that we're still basically incapable of talking about. And that baffles and saddens me, because obviously it's something we have to be able to address. And one of the great lies of migration and the identity question in recent years has been that we pretend that although, say, Greek to Australia migration is something that's still noteworthy, Afghan to Australian migration last year is not. And that's a lie. Everyone knows it's a lie. The question in the end comes down to the matter of, does the person arriving want to involve themselves into the society and integrate into it? Doesn't mean you give up all of your heritage or anything like it, but do they want to be Australian? If the answer is yes, then I think most Australians will be like, great, glad to have you with us. If the answer is no, what do you do?
There were some interesting contributions in the forum this morning about the concept of multiculturalism, in the sense, in the case of Britain, importing into Britain all these various cultures as if we're somehow ashamed as Brits, or in my case Australians, about the primacy or the importance of our own culture, that we end up having no culture at all. Is that a fair statement?
That is. This is what I said in The Strange Death of Europe, was we made a very odd decision when the era of mass migration began from what was then called the Third World. We made a very strange decision, which was that we would try to integrate people into our societies by saying effectively our societies aren't so great. It's a very strange thing when one thinks about it. You know, the world wants to move into your country, but your country says we're bad. And I mean, why would people be trying to, move into a bad country?
I've watched very closely what you've been doing over the last 16 months or so, ever since October 7. I mean, you have been a huge advocate for Israel and shining a light on anti-Semitism. It's a scourge around the world, but we've been hit particularly hard and surprisingly hard in Australia in ways I don't think we could have fathomed. Have you been surprised about the ferocity of anti-Semitism in places like Australia, but elsewhere, that were once, I would have regarded as incredibly tolerant?
Yeah, I mean, I wish I could say I was surprised. I'm not surprised. I am surprised by the size of the anti-Semitic backlash. I was in Australia last summer, and I was in 5 different cities. And I think every city I was in, unconnected with my presence, there was some kind of pro-Palestinian, anti-Israel protest. I was in Sydney and I was thinking, I can't help it, I was thinking, what the hell's it got to do with you? And when I say that, I don't mean that people shouldn't express their humanity, but what these people were doing was expressing their bigotry. And it's partly anti-Semitism, and it's partly the spreading of lies, which is obviously connected to that. And then there's the wild ignorance. I spent most of the last year and a half in the Middle East and being with the IDF in not just Israel, but in Lebanon and Gaza, elsewhere. And I've seen them up close, and I've seen the war up close. And it startles me that I go to a country like Australia and I see people on the street talking about a genocide that's not happened, or an ethnic cleansing that has not happened, or war crimes that have not happened, all the while forgetting to mention who started the war. The war was started by Hamas. Hamas were the ones who broke into Israel and murdered its citizens and kidnapped their citizens. You're not allowed to do that. And there is no law of war that says that if you start a war and then begin to lose it, that you should be regarded as the victim.
And look, I know you've got a big book coming out in April. We'll wait for that with a lot of interest. But just on the question of radical Islam, I spoke to John Anderson at the start of this conference. He says we must confront the elephant in the room in the West, and that is radical Islam. That's taken a long time for politicians to say that.
Yes, it has. Maybe too long. Maybe too long by many decades. Shouldn't be that hard, should it?
Can we confront it? Will we confront it?
We'll see. We'll see whether we produce statesmen and women or whether we produce eunuchs. We've produced an awful lot of political eunuchs in our countries in recent years. People who even now can't really bring themselves to identify a death cult when they see it. Who, between people who fight for life and people who fight for death, support the people who fight for death. Well, I see it. Many Australians see it. I hope we get the politicians who see it too.
Douglas Murray, thank you.
Thank you.